Morning, folks. When Ron rang me the other day to ask me to be rapporteur, I had to look it up. So sorry, this is my first chance at doing this sort of gig. Can I just start by acknowledging Paul and Auntie Matilda and Auntie Agnes and all the elders and their families for having us on their land. It's a privilege to be embraced by the elders here, and we are. So I really want to acknowledge and thank them for that. I also want to acknowledge the Lowitja Institute, and particularly Auntie Lowitja, who has been a tremendous influence to a lot of us, Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander and non-Indigenous, who have the privilege of working under her leadership for many, many years. So continue the great work, Ron. Also, your leadership is really critical in this space. So look, unfortunately, Kerry isn't here, and her topic, I'll speak to some of that question around integration of services in my summing up, but we've got about 25 minutes, so we've got a bit more time than we thought on questions. So I might just ask the panel, if I may start off, and then I'll open it up to the floor. Start off with a question to all of you. Why do you think there hasn't been more of a focus on the issues that you've researched in the past, and why now? Why now? Why do it now? So, Mike's who wants to go first?
All right. I think there probably hasn't been a focus because we don't look at evaluations in a system sort of way, and we don't look at them as a whole sort of in terms of a bit beyond project by project to look at what we're doing overall. And I think the reason it's come about is a lot of the talk that people are having around governance and data sovereignty and the deficit discourse issues, where there's a recognition that we do need to take that systems approach so that we can have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership at all levels, from performance frameworks to programs to evaluations.
I think in certain respects there has been a focus on this kind of thing in the past, but it's been talked about differently. It's not new to have conversations about the importance of things like partnership and looking at power dynamics. The importance of discourse has probably been more of a recent introduction since the late 90s, but I think actually Scott's work has been really instrumental in bringing this this idea of deficit discourse and how it influences our thinking into general circulation. Do you want to add anything?
Why it hasn't been researched? I think I don't know. I generally think that most people are really nice, and a lot of their stuff sits out of our awareness. So we mess around in this space. I think, Hannah's right, we've been mucking around in this space for a really long time. And people have been writing about it in certain ways. Professor Mick Dodson talked about it way back. And I think now we're talking about it in a different way. And I think it's more engaging. It's not as abstract in a whole heap of ways. And people can really get a sense of it. And I think what's been happening is some of the process that we've been running around our research has really started to engage people in the educational space. And I think that's made it a lot more easy and more accessible, and people kind of understand it a whole lot clearer. The other challenge is how do we take this into policy development, which is going to present another challenge, because practically on the ground, it's difficult, but not that hard, if you know what I mean. I think it's going to be really difficult in policy to try and take it into that space.
You mentioned the focus on doing things with us, which made me think about this whole notion of rescuing. And good people want to rescue. How would you respond to that? How would you turn that around? How would you encourage people that want to contribute constructively to the space of supporting our people to move forward? How would you turn that around from being a rescuer?
Man, that's a hard one. Noel Pearson talked about black saviours, white saviours, black dictators, white dictators, back in, I don't know, might have been in the 1990s or early 2000 there. And it really struck me because I was doing some work in our communities at that time and just seeing how people behaved and interacted with people that sort of needed our help and support. And he was spot on. There was a lot of dictators and saviours, and they were of all gender and all different colours. So again, this stuff doesn't discriminate. It's the way we think, the way we behave. For me, it's, have you got the courage to start to have a look within and to see what your assumptions are about a certain group of people that you're working with, and ask yourself that simple little question: am I doing two, doing four? And if you are, you're probably playing in a deficit space. And then the big question is, how do you move to the with? And it's about giving up some of your power, because sometimes, and that's the hardest thing for some of us, give away some of our power. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, starting to know ourselves a little bit more and be a little bit more kind and gentle.
Anyone else on the panel want to have a go at that? The rescuing question?
I sit on the WA Aboriginal Health Ethics Committee, and I see so many researchers, I think with good intentions, but I'm looking for, when I'm reviewing their applications, I look for, are there genuine partnerships? Has there been real consultation with communities? You might have a research idea, but is that a priority for that community? And has there been real, genuine power sharing and partnership and empowering that community from the grassroots level? It's those courageous conversations that we really need to be having. And is it a true partnership? Are you really power sharing with that community in order to, community-led solutions and true grassroots involvement in that project?
Thanks, Fran. You just maybe think about something else. A really practical way of doing this, and sometimes it's done, but quite often it's not. When we go out to do our consultations, and government or researchers go out to do consultations around stuff, quite often that's done, now it's done fairly good, the stuff that I've seen. Collect the information, but where it starts to fall down is when they take all that information back into their own office and sit with policy developers to make sense of that information they just got from the community. And how I think about it is the people who know most about that problem and how to fix it are the people who has the problem, not the people who are sitting there without the problem. And so that happens. So you take the problem away, and when you do that, the people who just give you the problem said, well, they're going to fix it now, so I can sit back here and watch. And if it doesn't work, I can blame them. So two things happen just in that little space there that I think creates a whole lot of challenges for policy and practice coming together.
Anyone else?
I might just add, as someone who's done research as an outsider in a community overseas, I think humbleness is extremely important. You're there to learn, and you come in and you've got to meet people on their own terms. And sometimes the rapidness with which some research is done doesn't always allow for that to happen as it should. So sometimes just slowing down and allowing people the space to do slow research can be important.
Okay, we've got about 15 minutes, so I might just open it up to the floor. If anyone would like to ask a question of any of the members of the panel. All right, we'll keep going then. Sorry, didn't see, sorry. So we need to have a mic. And Rom, I might seek your indulgence. Kerry's arrived, so we still will get her to do a presentation. Since she's come all this way.
This is a question for Scott. You talked about the dance of power. It's an excellent phrase. Can you talk about it some more for me?
Thank you. I think about we're in this constant, power dance or dance of power where we're co-creating power in every interaction that we have. Every time we sit down to have a conversation with somebody, right here, right now, we're in a power dance. I'm sitting up here with the mic talking on this stage, and you fellas are sitting there watching me. At any time you can get up and walk out of here and I'll be sitting here talking to myself, and I'll have no power at all. At the moment, I've got a lot of power. I'll give this mic to somebody else, and then they got the power. So it changes like this all the time, and sometimes we're doing it in our interactions, and we do it consciously. And if we're doing it consciously, we kind of know why we're doing it. When we do it unconsciously, then I think we're in a little bit of trouble, because the other person that we're dealing with feel like they haven't got any power in this situation at all because that fella's taken it all. Or I'm giving away my power and I don't know it until I walk away from that conversation. I start to feel bad about, why didn't I say that? I knew what was going on, but I didn't say anything. And I reckon that's the kind of work I'm trying to do, is getting people to be really conscious of that space, how we co-create this power in every interaction that we have, and then to make a conscious decision about doing something about it. And sometimes we choose not to. That's okay. But if you're not okay with it, you've got to question yourself why. And am I going to do it differently next time? Did that answer?
Thanks, Scott. I'll take another question and then we'll flick over to you, Kerry. Welcome. Sorry, do you want to say a few words first?
Thank you. It's so good to see you.
You too.
Very, very good to be here. My apologies, everyone, for my lateness. It was completely unintentional. It's also very good to see some family and friends here in the audience as well, and just take this moment to acknowledge the traditional owners. We're just delighted to be here with the Lowitja Institute in this research translation space, and want to celebrate the leadership of this incredible organisation for facilitating these kinds of discussions, and for also being such an enabler for courageous and innovative opportunities to come about, particularly for families. So the leadership that you've all got and the ways in which you engage and work through and with families and country is just something that has given a lot of us researchers a lot of strength and courage to do quite innovative things. To the other panellists, thanks so much for joining in again today, and I'll just very quickly talk, if I can, about the research translational process that we're engaged with, looking at regional integration, particularly of early childcare services, and the ways in which we work with partnerships. And just to reflect on the conversations around power, this is really around a power, it's about healing power and balanced relationships, by using philosophic traditions that underpin both Indigenous peoples plus other ecological thinkers' frameworks actually, and it's looking at using social emergence as ways of being able to initiate and scale regional initiatives, using families as the arbitrator and the centre from which we lead those kinds of discussions. So a lot of the work that we've just got done now in partnership arrangements is looking at multi-sites across New South Wales and Queensland, focusing on what it means to truly be family-led, for families to make decisions, family-centric, family-involved. Those kinds of languages have got their own disciplinary context from which they emerge. They also have a very political nuance that's often played out in policy or programmatic work. And what we're doing in the first instance is developing up a data dictionary just to really talk through what each of those terms means and make them very explicit in the way that we're looking at regional integration. What we're also mapping is then how people feel a sense of empowerment or that ability to be self-determining in decision-makings for their children. What often happens in policy and programmatic responses through government or non-government organisations or any service delivery is that families and family members become a commodifiable resource to those services. And so in the instance where we want for children to go to a doctor 6 times a year and 2 times because you've got the flu, you can imagine how disruptive that would be to a service delivery system that's completely dependent on a high turnover of client presentations and that a whole lot of the finances get redistributed because of that presence. But when you're self-determining and you're fit and healthy, you have power, you've got control, you've got the ability to support and look after your children, where you feel like you're in a position where you can leave legacies and the like, then that kind of welfareised engagement through service delivery systems is not as required. And we know internationally and locally that evidence says early life interventions are the ones that leverage maximised resources through families, but also then cascade the results of that early life intervention across the rest of a person's life. And so we are really focusing on doing this work. And again, the Lowitja Institute's leadership in this space has been exemplary. The ways that we're starting to do the family level of engagement is with some checklists. Everyone needs a checklist. But it's also a way of being able to make sure that their voices are heard. And when we talk about giving rights of children and the rights of children to have access to adequate servicing and for them to remain in homes, what we often don't do is focus on parents and parents' capabilities to make those things happen for their children. Ultimately, that is the best protective factor that we can have for our children, is to have fully responsible, engaged families and particularly parents. And that is their first right. And so working in this regionally integrated way, healing some of those power and balanced relationships, using different philosophic traditions that have both an Indigenous and a living systems basis, thinking about how you actually co-create networks that are innovative and disruptive. How do you actually connect pioneers in those new spaces? How do you nourish them and then create new communities of intent, and how you actually then illuminate what it is that they're able to do, at the same time as providing hospice services for those dominant, outmoded systems that no longer work, that no longer meet the requirements of people, but who service delivery agents or people within those systems have a high degree of investment in. How do you hospice those out while you're bringing in the new? And there's some really dynamic spaces in which I think we can really do some fantastic work with, through and on behalf of families.
Thanks, Kerry. Wow. Continue on the questions. We've got some more time if anyone wants to ask a question of any member on the panel. There's one down there, mate.
Thank you. Good morning. That was very, very useful. Indu Balachandran from the National Centre of Indigenous Excellence in Redfern, Sydney. We have just started to put some health research, impact research into place for our fitness centre that we run there. And I'm very curious, as a community-based organisation, we're trying to negotiate, I suppose, evidence-based practice, policy, programming on the ground, community needs, aspirations. And it's very difficult for us to be able to do all that and have impact immediately, which is what we want to do because we work with community every day. Fran's point on embedding evaluation, pace of research. We're currently in progress. Our research project is with the University of Sydney. Indigenous Aboriginal research, a wonderful process, very slow. Any advice from the panel for community organisations that are trying to align evidence-based practice, good practice, evaluation frameworks with immediate need of community?
Margaret's going to talk to this one and be excellent at it, but if you don't mind, I wouldn't mind just having a little go at it first. Just late comers, I've still got the mic, whatever. Stop that now. I've got the mic. One of the things that we're doing through First 1,000 Days is involving tenants of public housing organisations to become peer researchers, and they're part of the co-development of a survey which is focusing on identifying the aspirations of everyone aged 14 and up. What we've also been able to do with incredible success through Aboriginal Housing Victoria in particular is once families identify what their aspirations are, we hook them up with life coaches and mentors to help them achieve their aspirations. And so there is an immediate response. And I think within a 4-month period, they've been able to successfully help over 37 households achieve 200 aspirations. We've also seen then the transition of those peer researchers into full-time employment, and the people that they've been working with have also mobilised into employment and other sorts of strategies. It is a new part of a workforce that I think is underutilised, particularly for low-intensity interventions that have a really big impact on the sense of depression and other sorts of disorders that are fairly easily remediated by that level of intervention. So that's one way in which we've been able to do that work. The peer researchers then become pivotal in doing the analysis to help us understand and contextualise what's going on. And what we try to do is not only work with evidence-based work, but evidence-generative processes that show new ways of doing, thinking, being. And that is not traditionally able to be funded through the mechanisms that are in play for mainstream research agencies, and that's where the Lowitja Institute really comes into its own.
So I guess the strengths of community-based organisations is they already have a strong relationship with their communities, and they also have a great deal of expertise about how to work with those communities and engage with communities, which is almost entirely the opposite challenge that traditional research organisations have. So overall, it's really important to build longer-term partnerships, to see if you can find some partners who perhaps have those different strengths from you, because there are lots of people who are interested in adding their strengths to working on Indigenous issues. And I guess the other thing to think about is you don't need to do everything at once. If you have those longer term relationships, you don't have to get it all done in the first 3 years. You can think about what your key priorities are, pick the things that are easiest to do first, and do them really well, and build over time.
Yeah. And you're well placed within Redfern. You've got people close by in the high density community housing, the health service there. You're a, NCIE, got the gym there and all of those, physical activities. Empowering people about their health could be, health screening as part of your memberships, getting that baseline data for people. But, building up those strong partnerships and, partnering with community and their priorities and, knowledge is power and, greatest asset in terms of your health, long term is good health, biggest asset someone can have. And I think your organisation's so well placed to work with community find out what their priorities are, partner with a health service, engage in terms of, empowering people about their health. It could be a great project.
I just say, just check on how you frame your conversations and the purpose of it all, and just to ensure that you're not playing in the discourse, in the deficit discourse. So that's all.
Invite more if there's anyone else that would like it to ask. My eyes aren't that strong, so I'm just checking that no one's out there that wants to ask any more questions. I'll keep going then. So I'll ask another question of the panel. So given that you've done this research, how can people apply what they've learned from your research? So what would be the tips that you'd give to applying what you've found, particularly for government, but not only for government?
No, I'm sounding like a crack record here. All I'll be really challenging people to do is, go back and check all your policies now, check all your practices now, and question yourself and challenge your own assumptions about the approach that you're putting towards some of the challenges that you're facing. And if you have any doubts that you might be playing in the doing to and doing for the Aboriginal people, and making the assumptions that they have very little capacity to be able to do it themselves, perhaps check it out with other people.
One of the things that we do is build coalitions of people who have got similar exposure to information, and then they get mobilised to go out and do things within their own regions, and they localise the intentions and they work within the parameters that they've got on site. But one of the very powerful lessons that people often take away with them is the power of language in policy documents. And this is just one very clear little tiny example, and if you all do this as immediately as walking out of this room and make this happen, I'd be really grateful. But we always talk about, we don't give people an identity, we give people an experience. So we don't use any language that refers to vulnerable children, disadvantaged family. In fact, there's no such thing. There is no such thing as a marginalised community. There is no such thing as a bashed up mum. There's just no such thing as that. No one in this room is in the business of giving someone else an identity. But what we all need to do is empathetically engage with their experience. So there are children who experience vulnerability, there are families who experience marginalisation. And once you change from giving people an identity, which locks them into a narrative about how they need to represent themselves to the world in order to be incentivised to participate, and you recognise their experience, and you put the onus of responsibility back on them and provide them with resources and capabilities in order to transform their experiences, then what you have done is really help build self-determining families. So that's probably lesson number one, really, is just never give anyone identity, always acknowledge their experience. And this came home to roost for me very recently, where a young fellow who was working with me here in Canberra. He was a mongrel of a kid, but he kept on turning up. And he was one of my peer educators when I was working here at Sexual and Reproductive Health. He came back into the room up in Bulloch just recently as a colleague now, and that's a big 10 years. But he said, when I was in that really vulnerable state, what I was also doing was making sure that all my younger brothers and sisters were getting out the school, that they were dressed, they had food. I was looking after mum from getting hit. I was doing all these other things. So actually, if I only talked about him as being a vulnerable adolescent, then I would never have had the opportunity to truly see all of these strengths that he had, all of these incredible capabilities, even though his circumstance was vulnerable. I could never have valued that. The other thing that we do, particularly in working with families, is make the contribution of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander men completely invisible. or we perpetuate an incredible violence to them by talking about mums and bubs programs, about men's contributions to family as only being perpetrators of violence, and we tend to tar everyone with the same brush, and we don't acknowledge what roles and responsibilities, both cultural and practical, that men have during that very early period of time, and how we actually engage with this gendered equity approach and giving power to men to really step up during that time, I think really does play into the ruination of our society. So if you could find some ways to represent our men better, differently, powerfully, as kindness, as nurturing, as capable of a range of emotions without losing or threatening their masculinity, we'd all be incredibly grateful.
So I guess in terms of our research, we'd really like the evidence base to be transparent and responses to be provided to communities so that they know that the information they're providing is going somewhere and people are acting on it and that they're being heard. It's really important that there's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leadership and partnership at all levels of policy making, because what we find is evaluations follow programs, programs follow performance frameworks, and if those values at the top level are not right, if they're not what everybody wants, that cascades down and we end up with an evaluator who can't really meet the needs of the community because the program is not what the community wanted in the first place. So those are really important. And finally, it's in terms of the two frameworks we've developed, it's really important that we do evaluate the principles that we think are important for working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and our framework will help you do that. Our second framework will also help develop a more systemic approach to understanding ethics in evaluation so that all of the people involved in the evaluation take responsibility for delivering outcomes in an ethical way. Anybody else?
Okay, folks. I think if there's no further questions, we might go to the next phase. And thank you on behalf of the conference. Can we just thank I'd just like to just finish up by summing up. But before I do, I was remiss in not acknowledging you, Pat. I'm very sorry for that. I didn't see you in the room, actually. It's my eyesight. So I apologise. I want to acknowledge your tremendous leadership through all the things that you've done. In most recent times, the LaRue statement, chairing that body of work, and I hope that all that effort that you put in as leading that body of work and consulting with our many leaders across the nation comes to fruition down the track and in the not too distant future. So thank you, and thank you for all your work. So trying to summarise all of this, made a few notes. Just on the presentation by Margaret and Fran, their research highlights what we all know, really, that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need to be involved in all stages of the strategy and program development, from identifying the challenges to determining the causality, to agreeing to the impact we're trying to make, and to evaluating whether the designed response achieves the desired impact. In my view, it highlights the limitations of the current outcomes model of investment, and some in the bureaucracy have heard me say that before, which deems evaluation as a further down the line process and promotes the need to build evaluation in at the forefront of the design of the program or strategy as it is done in the development community context, thereby focusing the parties on the impact they're seeking to make rather than the outcome or the output. The lack of transparency on sharing the information, or lack of opportunity to find it, impedes research, impedes practice and collaboration. It doesn't allow people to understand what works, let alone what doesn't work. And the under-reporting of evaluations, or the finding that there's not enough evaluation work, may in fact be that the evaluations aren't shared or are made publicly available, rather than there not being enough done. That's some of what I gathered on that. And also the concern from the very mob that we're trying to support, that there's not enough return on investment for their effort that they put into evaluations. They're not seeing the results in the way that they would like to see them. And obviously the ethics on the responsibility of all the players along the food chain, because you mentioned that the evaluators don't necessarily deliver the findings. I thought that was a pretty important message to repeat. I'll move to deficit discourse and Hannah and Scott's presentation. And what I gathered from that was that first of all, it's a very important contribution to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policy space. It's more than just deficit language. It's a mindset that is embedded in a power dynamic. It plays out in so many different ways across society broadly. You hear it in pubs, you hear it in workplaces, you hear it in your own families. You keep telling people that they're underachievers or they've got problems, they're going to believe it, they're going to start, and it's going to manifest into more serious problems. And that's, from all of our experience, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, that's what's happening. It perpetuates stereotypes of racial and cultural inferiority. Terms like, and I've used these terms as a bureaucrat, terms like normalisation, disadvantage, advancement, dysfunction. See Western society as the benchmark First Nations people should aspire to. It views our people and their challenges as problems that need to be fixed, which in turn underpins how policies, programs and strategies of government particularly are developed, and indeed it plays out in recruitment, how people are recruited. It favours people with program policy expertise over engagement specialists, people that fix stuff over people that support others to address their own challenges and support their capacity, their agency. And I think, I've worked with a lot of wonderful people over a long career. That is still a problem. Deficit discourse keeps us in a service delivery paradigm. Services are there to fix problems. Strength-based approaches, even though there's not an agreed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander definition, as the research found, seek to move us to a development paradigm. Deficit discourse impacts health. As I said, people internalise the negativity. And probably the key finding is changing the narrative will lead to positive health outcomes. And simple things we can do to change the narrative. When you go into a community, the last thing you should be talking about is a program. Because the minute you talk about a program, you're prescribing the solution. We've got something to fix your problem. You should delay, from my experience, I'm sure I speak for these guys here, you should delay the program to silver bullet. Well, you shouldn't even really go in there with it. The minute you talk about a housing program, you've already come up with the answer, rather than letting the very people themselves. And that's, I think, part of this deficit mindset that we go in with good intention, though. And to Sister Kerry's presentation, it's really critical work, family-led, family-centric approaches, the idea of a data dictionary, self-determining, families being, or parents being self-determining in decisions affecting their families, and particularly the children, making sure voices are heard. The focus on integration in the title of your presentation is particularly important, as past and existing whole of government and place-based approaches have focused on coordinated delivery of services, synchronising inputs, button them up at the right time, rather than proper integration, which is a seriously difficult thing for all of us, whether we're in an Indigenous organisation or in a government agency or a non-Indigenous organisation. It requires a rethinking and an analysis of the causality and working out what bit that you can contribute to. And understanding the interdependencies rather than saying, well, I've done my bit. You've got to understand the interdependencies, the success factors. It requires a broader analysis of the systems. I'm pleased to hear a bit of talk around systems and the services families need to raise children and to treat the community as a whole system containing many interconnected parts, issues, challenges, relationships, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. For Aboriginal and Torres Strait people, the phrase "it takes a whole village to raise a child" is literal. It's absolutely how we see the world. Our extended families and the attachment to community really means everything. It really means everyone in the village has a stake in raising our children, and people on this panel have helped raise mine. This brings a sharp focus on the efficacy of current place-based approaches and on efforts to coordinate program and service delivery, not just at a government level, but at the service provider level. The sectoral silos exist at many levels. To me, and I'll be controversial, it matters little if an Aboriginal organisation or Torres Strait Islander organisation delivers a service in a passive way. The end result is passivity, whether it's an Indigenous organisation or not. So we have to move to an active service delivery framework that is about agency and about community control and family control. My last point is really for all of you. Thank you. I want to thank you all for the work that you're doing and the research. As a former bureaucrat, I really want to say there are a lot of good people there that are struggling to try and work out how to apply valuable work like this. I wish it was as simple as, I said this out there to someone outside, it was wrong. I wish it was as simple as the racist inside the government and we're carrying the can for their racism. That to me can be fixed. But the sectoral silos created over 100 years of bureaucracy, they're serious challenges to try and get to the integration that you're talking about. So I ask that, I implore all the people in this room to think about how do you actually go to that distance of the changing the discourse, pushing for viable place-based approaches that aren't program-centric, that are about inclusion. So that's really my take on what we've heard today, and I'd like to invite Ron back up to take us to the next stage. Thanks, Ron.
Just as a very small token of our appreciation, Geoffrey, this is our 20-year history, changing the narrative in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health research published last year, which took us from 1997, where the Aboriginal Community Control Services, Congress and Danila Dilba in Darwin, after much negotiation, Pat was the instrumental in leading those negotiations with the research community. That was the genesis of the Lowitja Institute. So this is a small token of our appreciation. For someone who had to look up rapporteur, you rapporteured pretty well, my brother.